Oh, Elisheva, give me permission to record, please.
I already started.
Oh, okay, we're recording. That was my lovely daughter. She is helping me out with all the technical stuff. And now we begin. Parshat Vayechi is the last parsha of the book of Genesis, of the book of Bereshit. It takes place in the land of Egypt, and that's where the Jews are going to be until the Exodus takes place, which we're going to discuss in next lectures. The parsha brings to a close, other than Moshe, okay, Jacob is the most, has the most life in the Torah. He starts in Parshat Toldot, Vayetze, Vayishlach, Vayigash, Vayeshev, Miketz, Vayichi, 7 or 8 parshas, and they talk about him and his family. Obviously, Yaakov is a key figure. He is the he is the third member of the forefathers. Abraham started it all. Yitzchak continued the process, and Yaakov is called Yisrael. Now, this is important to know that Yaakov gets his name changed. What's interesting is that even though his name is changed, he still has the name Yaakov. So sometimes he's called Yaakov and sometimes he's called Yisrael. It's unusual because Abraham also had his names changed. And once his name was changed from Avram to Avraham, it never goes back. And Sarai as well. But Yaakov seems to have, throughout his whole life, sometimes he becomes that Yisrael, and sometimes he reverts back to Yaakov. Scholars for centuries have tried to explain the difference between the usage of the name Yaakov and the usage of the name Yisrael, and have not succeeded. I have not read a coherent argument as to why sometimes Yaakov's name is used and sometimes Yisrael's name is used. We can try, there are theories, but they just, I don't think they hold water. But nevertheless, in order to begin Parshat Vayechi, and I really want to focus on Yaakov. I think he's a fascinating personality. And we have to ask ourselves, what kind of personality is he? You know, in literary works, personalities are developed, and you can frame a person, you can coin them, you can describe them. You know, Abraham would be the monotheist, or Abraham would be the initiator, Abraham would be the hero. Yitzchak would be the one who underwent the sacrifice, the Akedah. He might have solidified what Abraham started. He's the second generation. What would we say about Yaakov's life? Okay, now the rabbis have their own approach to it, but when we read the stories, you know, how would we describe Yaakov's life? How would Yaakov describe Yaakov's life? And that's what we're going to discuss because it appears in last week's parsha, and we're going to try to analyze it because we are going to stick to the letter of the text called Pshat, and we're going to try to learn from the text of who is, how he is presented, to try to come at some kind of conclusion as to Yaakov's personality. Would I say that he was fulfilled? I wouldn't say he was a fulfilled personality. Would I say that he was a heroic success? I wouldn't say he was a heroic success. He might have some aspects of heroism, some successes, but would I say he's tragic? So we'd have to think about that because there's a lot of tragedy in Yaakov's life. And so we'd have to, you know, I think in the end, I would say that Yaakov is complex, and we'll talk about that and see if that holds water. Is that good enough for us to say that he is a complex personality? Obviously, the rabbinic perspective is that Yaakov is the ideal. Yaakov is the choicest. Yaakov is the one who bears the name Yisrael. We are the children of Israel. We kind of emulate the Yaakov experience, and that's something to think about. That we're not the sons of Abraham and we're not the sons of Isaac. We are the sons of Israel. Now, we're not the sons of Yaakov, which is interesting. We're the sons of Israel. And I mentioned that Yaakov sometimes transforms to the Israel, which we all recognize after fighting with the angel. And God, as I mentioned in previous classes, God says, your name now will be Israel, for you have struggled with those and you have succeeded, you have prevailed. So Israel is a really amazing idea, and Yaakov sometimes becomes Israel, and sometimes reverts to Yaakov. And when we are being called Bnei Yisrael, we are saying we are the children of the aspirational Yaakov. That's cool, to be an aspirational Yaakov. Now, our job is to figure out what does it mean to be an aspirational Yaakov. It means when Yaakov aspired to something in his life, which he didn't hold on to, which he wasn't able to be consistent with, but nevertheless he reached, that becomes the model of what we can be, which I think is fascinating. So this is not to say that Yaakov had an easy life. It's the opposite, in fact. And that is also something we need to consider, that the Torah presents Yaakov as someone who is worthy of emulating, worthy of this title, worthy of all these accolades, and yet struggled throughout his entire life. So this is what we're going to talk about in our class today, and we're going to do it by starting in chapter 45. Chapter 45 is last week's Parsha, but it's all fluid. You can't just say, well, I have to start with 48 because it's this week. It's the story of Yaakov. We can't go all the way back to the beginning, but we can appreciate where it is right now. Now, if I want to talk about Yaakov going down to Egypt to meet his son Yosef, which is really maybe the high point in his life after going through such a tumultuous experience of years and years and years thinking he was dead and going through everything that meant, then I need to start with chapter 45, verse 28. The brothers came back and they were so elated, and they said, our brother is alive, and you know what? He's a Moshel b'chol Eretz Mitzrayim. He is a leader in all of Egypt, and that is so wonderful. And he says he brought us all these gifts, and he brought us all these wagons, and he wants you to come to Egypt to see him. Interestingly enough, in the last verse of chapter 45. Vayomer Yisrael, and Israel says, my son Joseph is still alive. I will go and I will visit him before I die. Now, and then in the next verse, Vayisa Yisrael, and Israel, right, Jacob, who becomes Israel, starts to travel to see his son before he dies. Now, the question is, what's on the mind of Yaakov at this moment? When he says, I'm going to go to Egypt to see my son before he dies, is it in his mind, I'm moving to Egypt? I'm going to die in Egypt. I'm leaving Israel. Or is he saying, I'm going to see my son? That's a debate. And what I want to try to understand, I want to get into, of course, I can't, but I want us to get into trying to understand the mindset of Yaakov. What is he thinking? What is he feeling? What does it mean that he is going to leave his home? Sorry, I'm just trying to make it easier. He's going to leave his home and he's going to visit his son. So Yaakov, or who is Israel, sets out and he comes to Beersheba. Of course, he's going south. So when he gets to Beersheba, he makes sacrifices to God, the God of his father Isaac, which is interesting. Why is he making a sacrifice? Beersheba is like a border town. So it means he's at the edge of the land of Israel, his inherited homeland. How does Yaakov feel at this moment? We don't know. All we know is that the previous verse, he seemed to be excited to see his son. And in this verse, he's offering sacrifices. So verse number 1, elation. Verse number 2, prayer. And now come verse number 3. God called to Israel in a vision at night. And he said, Jacob, Jacob. He said, I'm here. And he said, I am God, the God of your father. Fear not to go down to Egypt, for I'll make you there a great nation. Now, we can learn the inferences of the Torah, right? If God says, fear not, we must conclude, or I think we should conclude, that Yaakov feared. Otherwise, God wouldn't have said, fear not, right? God wouldn't have said, don't, laugh if he wasn't laughing. You don't just randomly say to someone, don't be X. You say to someone who you have a feeling that they're acting like that, they might be like that you say, you shouldn't worry about that. We conclude that Yaakov was worrying. Now the question is, when was he worrying? At what stage was Yaakov fearful? And what was he fearful about? This is the question. And then God comes in verse 3 and 4 to say, why, to allay those fears, to say you should not be afraid because this, and this, we'll get to that. But what we need to figure out is, well, what is it that Yaakov might be frightened about? Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch lived in the 19th century in Germany. He says that, like we said, Yaakov started out his journey excited. He's going to meet his son. He offers sacrifices to God. So he wants to know what changed his mood. And he answered, ironically, it's God who changed his mood. It's God who made him nervous. After all, let's look back at the text. Yaakov, God calls out to Israel in a vision, and he doesn't say Israel, he says Yaakov, Yaakov, Jacob, Jacob. That's the lower version of Jacob, right? And then he says, and by the way, what type of vision was it? This is an unusual term. It's called a vision by night. It doesn't mean night vision. It means in a dream he had at night. Now, there are different layers of prophecy. When Abraham was visited by God, it wasn't a night vision. It was out in the open. It was in the day, and the day symbolizes, something clear. A night symbolizes something frightful. And therefore, Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch says that when God appeared to him in a night vision, he got nervous. And he started to wonder whether this is perhaps it's the last vision of God. Remember when Yaakov's first vision of God was? It was in a dream at night. Remember, he was running away from his brother, and he stopped off in the forest, and he went to sleep, and God came to him in a vision, in a dream. And that dream was, go to the land of, you'll be I'll take care of you in the land of Israel. And now he's leaving the land of Israel. And God comes to him once again in a night vision. So according to Samson Raphael Hirsch, this is what got Yaakov nervous. He was unsure what would be. According to Rabbi Meir Leibush, the Malbim, he has a different approach. He says that there are 6 things that Yaakov was nervous about. How do we know there are 6 things that Yaakov was nervous about? Because God responds by saying 6 types of things. For example, he says, I am God, the God of your father. He says, don't fear going to Egypt. He says, I'll make you there a great nation. I'll go down with you. I'll come back with you, and Joseph will protect you. So if we reverse that, we might be concerned that Yaakov is thinking, is he my God? Should I be going to Egypt? Is God going to be with me? Am I going to make it back to Israel? And is Joseph going to be around? And therefore the Malbim responds in each verse. He says, fear not, that God said fear not, because Yaakov was afraid his sons will assimilate. And God said, don't worry, your sons will become part of a great nation. And then he says, maybe my family will be a good nation, but they'll be very small. After all, we're leaving our homeland and we're not going to be able to multiply. And God says, don't worry, it's going to be great. And maybe he said that God won't come down with me. After all, God stays in the land of Israel. Maybe God won't be with me. And God said, no, don't worry, I will go down with you. And he says, well, maybe he won't be buried in his ancestral plot. And God says, don't worry, I will bring you back up. And your sons will come back, and your son Joseph will be there. All of this points to the theory, okay, that Yaakov was nervous for all these reasons. And God comes to assuage him, to allay his fears, to make him feel better, to comfort him. The question we ask is Yaakov comforted? Did it work? This is what I think Yaakov's concerned about. Number one, he's concerned about his family. After all, how much did Yaakov know about what the brothers did to Yosef and what Yosef did to the brothers, and how much enmity and hatred there was, and whether it was still around? I think this was on Yaakov's mind. And he's wondering about himself. How much is he part of the three great forefathers? You know, Abraham moved to the Holy Land and stayed there. Isaac stayed there on the Holy Land the whole time. Where Yaakov is born in the Holy Land, runs away for 20 years, comes back for a bunch of years, and then has to leave again for years. He is therefore unclear about his role in whether he deserves to be part of the inheritor of this land, which he's leaving. And then there's a third aspect, which is the feeling of being dislocated and displaced from your homeland. So in this context, Yaakov comes to Yosef, and I skipped the meeting that Yaakov has with Yosef. It's very emotional, it's very beautiful. They cry on each other's shoulders, and Yaakov says, I can die now that I've seen you, and it's certainly a high point in Yaakov's life. However, we should not conclude that this moment represents the essence of Yaakov's life, that he was joyous and happy, that everything was fine. Because Yaakov was much more complex. We see this complexity in the meeting that Yaakov has with Pharaoh. It's a fascinating meeting from beginning to end, but the meeting is very short. It begins with Yaakov blessing Pharaoh, which was unusual, and Pharaoh asking Yaakov a question, which is also unusual. He asks, how old are you? Who asks someone how old you are? I mean, what is that? Why is that an important part of this meeting that they're having this? You know, he has 2 minutes with the Pharaoh. He gives him a blessing, and the Pharaoh says, how old are you? That's strange. What's even more strange is that is Yaakov's answer. Here is Yaakov's answer in verse 9. And Jacob answered Pharaoh, the years of my sojourn on earth are 130. Few, and the translation he says here is hard. The Hebrew word is ra. Ra is zhle, is terrible, is bad. They've been bad and they've been few, and they don't come near the lifespan of my fathers during their lives. And then he gave a blessing to Pharaoh and he goes away. What a negative perspective, what a negative position to give to the king of Egypt. Why did Yaakov present himself this way? So the commentaries discuss this. And Chizkuni, a rabbi from around 500 years ago, he said the following: when Pharaoh asked, how old are you? It's because Yaakov looked very old. Okay, he was 130, but his father died at 170. His father died at 180. His grandfather died at 175, and they were busy till their last breath. Yaakov was at 130. He slowed down. He looked tired. And Pharaoh thought, this guy looks really, really old. What's wrong with him? And he asked them, therefore, how old are you? And the Midrash tries to develop this. And Yaakov said, don't be surprised that I look so old, because the experiences that I've undergone during my life have made their mark on me. And life is a series of harsh experiences. Yaakov lived 33 years less than his father and 28 years less than his grandfather because he didn't appreciate the life he was given. If you ask Yaakov what your life was about, you know what he would say? He would say, I deceived my father, I ran away from my brother, I struggled with my father-in-law, I struggled with my brother again, I struggled with my daughter, and then I struggled with my son. That's a lot of struggling. And the Midrash, in a very harsh way, says to Yaakov, oh, you didn't like your life? Well, then maybe you don't deserve all of it. What a powerful lesson there. You don't think that that your life is worthy. You don't think that your time that you have affected others and the time you have been able to serve God is valuable, and you think that you're willing to disparage it. Well, God doesn't think that you then deserve maybe that length of time. Obviously, we are supposed to learn a lesson here, according to the Midrash, that Yaakov is being punished and saying, your life is a gift, and every experience is invaluable. And you learn from your mistakes, and you learn from your struggles, and you don't ignore your triumphs either, which we wonder whether Yaakov did just that. This brings us to our parsha. Okay, so what I want to say is the following: Yaakov's 130 years old. He's lived a whole life, and now he's moving to Egypt to see his son and be taken care of by his son for the next 17 years. And that's when our parsha begins. And here is the verse. And Jacob lived for 17 years. And Jacob's life in Egypt, and Jacob's life was 147 years. And now it's going to discuss the 147th year. What's missing? What's missing is the 17 years. Very strange. It's as if, Jacob said, well, those 17 years, which were we might expect, most joyous, families all around him, seeing grandchildren, seeing great-grandchildren, quiet and tranquil. And Jacob says, I don't want that to be written in this Torah. That's not really part of my life. It's fascinating. He's not willing to give himself these 17 years. It's as if he wants to punish himself. The Torah doesn't want to tell us about what it was like for Jacob in Egypt during these 17 years, which we can only assume was, the lap of luxury, his son taking care of him, the families together. So why is Jacob missing these 17 years? I wonder, this is a midrash which talks about how these 17 years where there was tranquility represent the essence of Jacob's life. They were the high point in his life, the most serene, the most joyous. And you might think that therefore Yaakov would kind of go out on a high. He would be happy with his life, because you remember the last 17 of your life, which were wonderful. So it kind of drowns out the 100 years beforehand, which were really a real struggle. And yet Yaakov's not willing to do that for us. He's not willing to ignore the struggle. And I wonder about that. I wonder why Yaakov isn't letting us let him let go. And I wonder if it's intentional that Yaakov is saying that my life is not these 17 years. My life is the struggle. And you have to accept that if you want to be part of my legacy and my history. Sometimes the struggle is more tumultuous and torturous, and sometimes it's my fault, and sometimes it's external forces. But know this, says Yaakov, I'm not going to live my existence and tell you that my life is about from the day that I left my homeland and spent 17 years in exile being taken care of by my son. That's not who I am. You don't like the fact that I'm presenting myself as a complicated, struggling personality? Well, too bad. That's who I am. And therefore, I'm not telling you anything about my 17 years. Yeah, I'm sure they were fine. I was a Zeta, I was a grandfather, I sat with all my grandchildren, everyone was happy and nice, but that's not who I am, because that's not my agenda, it's not my mission in life. For example, as I said, the next verse after it says that Yaakov spent 17 years in Egypt, the next verse is, and he was about to die. The days approached for Israel to die. Once again, this is why I tell you that it's really hard to understand the difference between when the name Yaakov is used and when the name Israel is used. Here it says Yaakov lived in 17 years and Yaakov's life was 147. And the next verse it says, and Israel was about to die. I can't explain why it was chosen, the name then. But I will say the following. What is it that Yaakov does in his final year or his final months that the Torah records? So the first thing I want to say is Rashi says, everyone of whom it's stated that his days drew near to die means that he didn't live the life of his fathers. There's a hint already that Yaakov wants to remind us, oh, I had tranquil 17 years. It doesn't make a difference. I still have not reached my ideal state. I still have not reached where I aspire to reach. What does he aspire to reach? Maybe the level of his father, maybe the level of his grandfather, maybe to do more of what he's supposed to do in his life. After all, there are major mistakes that Yaakov made, and they plague him throughout his life, some of which he is able to overcome, which make him great, and some of which stay with him because psychologically they were part of who he was and he couldn't let go. And that creates the complicated personality, but no less heroic. For example, what does Yaakov do as he's about to die? He summons his son, Joseph. By the way, he has 12 sons, but he's, okay, we can understand that. He summons Joseph because Joseph is the one who can get things done. After all, he's the leader of all of Egypt. He says the following, Imna matzati chen beinecha, if I have found favor in your eyes, which is a strange thing for a father to say to a son, then please place your hand under my thigh and make an oath of your loyalty to do kindness and truth, which is, don't bury me in Egypt. Yaakov forces his son Joseph to swear to not bury him in Egypt. Where does he want to bury it? In Israel. Bury me in my birthplace, in my Machpelah, where my father was buried, my grandfather. And look at verse 31. Joseph, who I'm sure is shocked. I'm the confidant of my father. I took care of my father for 17 years. I'm the closest I am to my father, and he wants me to swear? What, he doesn't trust that I'm going to do it? And the commentaries try to figure this out, and they say, oh, he had to tell Pharaoh that I made an oath, and oaths were very serious. Still, I'm uncomfortable. Why is Yaakov forcing Joseph to swear to bury him in Egypt? I assume because a small part of Yaakov thought Joseph isn't leaving Egypt, and Israel isn't leaving, the people, my tribe isn't leaving Egypt, and I'm stuck here. And it weighed heavily on him. Now, this is strange that it weighed so heavily on him, because after all, don't we remember that one of the things that God promised Yaakov is, I will go down to Egypt with you, but I will bring you back up. What about that prophecy? There is the prophecy of God, and then there's human emotions. Yaakov felt inadequate, and he felt that perhaps he wasn't going to make it. And therefore, at the end of his life, he got into this mode of a very formal Yaakov forcing his son to take an oath to swear to him that he's going to bury him in Egypt, in Israel. Despite this, the next parsha, the next story that takes place in chapter 48, in verses 1 to 6, is the seesaw, right? We kind of see Yaakov in his depression, that he's underwhelmed or underachieving, and then and you think that he's kind of giving up. And then in chapter 48, he does the exact opposite, which makes him so great, in so much like us, where we're inconsistent. And sometimes, we get down and we're not able to move on. And then we kind of gather ourselves and we say, no, we have a mission. We have a goal that we have to reach. And what's Yaakov's mission? Yaakov's mission is to ensure the future of his tribe, of his family, that there's unity, that they know that their connection to the land of Israel, that even though he spent the end of his life in Egypt, they are nevertheless displaced. They are not where they belong. And in order to function properly and healthily in the future, he needs to remind them of each other and remind them of the vitality of to be part of the tribe of Israel. So what does he do? Verse 1, your father is ill. This is the first time, the Midrash comments, this is the first time in the Torah that someone got sick. And we think that sickness is a terrible thing, that sickness is in fact a gift. Why is it a gift? Because until Jacob, everyone was doing busy and going about their business, and then they died. And they didn't have time to get their affairs in order. Whereas Yaakov, apparently he got sick and he had time to get his affairs in order. And what were those affairs? The future of the tribe of Israel, of his own tribe. So he takes, Joseph brings his two sons, Menashe and Ephraim. And in verse 3, Yaakov says the following: God blessed me in the land, in Luz, in the land of Canaan. And he said, I'm going to make you into a great nation. And I'm going to give you this land. And it's going to be an inheritance. Okay, these are the final words that he's saying, almost the penultimate really, to Joseph, that the inheritance of the land is what's going to draw the people back there and give them strength and give them, a center. that they'll be able to revolve around, the land of Israel. And now here's what I'm telling to you, Joseph. Your sons who were born in Egypt, I will treat them like my own sons. In other words, my grandchildren are going to be like my sons. Now, Yaakov had many grandchildren. He had probably had tens and tens and tens of grandchildren, but only Yosef's two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, Yaakov is saying, I'm going to elevate them. I'm going to raise them to the level of the members of the tribe. Okay? Why does Yaakov do this? Why does Yaakov elevate Ephraim and Manasseh? Many theories are expounded, but one of them is that, once again, let's remind ourselves that Yaakov's chosen wife is Rachel, and her eldest son is Yosef. In Yaakov's mind, Yosef receives a double portion. And therefore, he wants to give this double portion that his sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, they receive the gift of being of the piece of the land of Israel, which in fact happened. Manasseh and Ephraim are each tribes in Israel because of Yaakov's foresight, because Yaakov is saying that at this point, I am concerned about the welfare of the tribe, the inheritance, the apportioning of the land, and making sure that this is going to be the 12 tribes of Israel. And Yosef, you will be a part of it. Now, that is Yaakov in his Israel, is ideal and his aspirational. And then we're reminded one verse of the Yaakov, the psychologically challenged Yaakov. Why? Because it says in the following, in verse 7, and when I was returning from Padan, my wife Rachel died to my sorrow, and I was only able to bury her on the road to Ephrat. Yaakov, in his mind, we know, he knows rationally that he has 4 wives, and he knows that Leah is buried in the Machpelah, but in his mind, there's only one. There's only Rachel. And the fact that he could never escape that hold that she had on him, and that connection that they had, and how it spilled over to his relationship with Yosef versus the other brothers, that's something that Yaakov could never get rid of. Why does he mention something about the burial right here? Remember, he's talking about the apportionment of the land, and all of a sudden he says, oh, and Rachel wasn't able to be buried in Machpelah, she was buried in Ephrat, Beit Lechem. Rashi explains that Yaakov is apologizing to Yosef and saying, Yosef, you're going to get back to the land of Israel, and you're going to go and search for the ancestral plot of a burial site. And you're going to see, according to the Midrash, Adam and Chava, and you're going to see Abraham and Sarah, and you're going to see Yitzchak and Rivka, and you're going to see Leah, and you're not going to find your mother. And you're going to bring me there, and I'm going to sit there with Leah. And Yaakov felt uncomfortable about that, and therefore he says to him, I just want to tell you, she died there, and that was her wish, that she'd be buried there for whatever, reasons that she had. It's possible, it's possible. And what I wanted to show is that this is Yaakov's last soliloquies, and Rachel is on his mind, and he can never, go away from that. And it's something that will stick with him throughout until his final breath. Yaakov continues, and in chapter 48, the next 12 verses, he gives a blessing to his grandchildren, which has become the tradition of Jews in the modern Orthodox community, or the Orthodox community, to bless their children. And they give this blessing, the same blessing that Yaakov gave his grandchildren, is the blessing that we give our children. Now, this seems very nice. Once again, it's part of this idea that Yaakov is telling Joseph, I'm treating you specially because you're the apple of my eye, and I'm giving a blessing to your sons. Um, and then something unique but not so unique happens with this story. How did Yaakov get into this whole mess? We remember. Yaakov was the younger child who kind of usurped the blessing of the older child, right? And then he ran away from his brother, and then all the mess that took place. Then when he had his sons, his eldest son was Reuven, his fourth son, Reuven, fifth son, no, much later is Yosef, and he favored Yosef instead of the elder. And you'd think that Yaakov learned his lesson that you can't favor one over the other. You have to follow the tradition of what's expected. And look what happens in the last story of Yaakov's life. He sees that Yosef, his two sons, were there, and he says to him, "These are my sons," and he says, "Let me bless them." And Israel said, verse 11, Yaakov changed his name to Israel, said, I never thought I'd see you again, Joseph, and now God has let me see your children beautiful. It's a poignant moment. Joseph then takes his two sons, and he puts his oldest son in his left hand so that he can be blessed by Yaakov's right hand. And he put his youngest son in his right hand so he can be blessed by Yaakov's left hand, because your right hand is the more important blessing. And therefore, Yaakov's right hand is next to the head of Menashe, and his left hand is next to the head of Ephraim. And what does Yaakov do? He crosses his hands. And he puts his right hand on Menashe, on Ephraim, and his left hand on Menashe, and he gives the blessing, and Yosef is very upset, because as consistent as Yaakov is in not following the standard order and kind of going in the opposite way, so Yosef is consistent in saying, no, there's a way to do things, and this is the right way that you should go. Yaakov gives the blessing, Amalach hago eloti mikol ra. The angel that has guarded me will bless these children, B'Shem Avotai Avraham Yitzchak, by my father's and grandfather's name. And when Yosef sees that Ephraim got the greater blessing, he got very angry. And he said to his father, no, you're doing it wrong. And Yaakov said, I know, my son, I know. But what can I say? I see in the future that Ephraim will be greater than Menashe. I am going to give Ephraim, the younger son, the greater blessing over Menashe. Something we need to think about, in modern times, when we're thinking about parenting and how everything is supposed to be evenly distributed and the like, and that makes the most sense. In the biblical level, that wasn't the case. It was the eldest child gets more because that's what's expected, and everyone else is expecting of that. And Yaakov changed it all. And Yaakov consistently changes it by saying, it's what I see in Ephraim, who, by the way, Joshua comes from the tribe of Ephraim, that I'm going to bless Ephraim more than Menashe, which is interesting in the end, where Yaakov stays Yaakov. He bucks the system, he suffers the consequences, but he's willing to stand by it because that's what he believes in. By the way, Yosef is exactly the same way. He has his dreams. He knows that God is talking to him. He doesn't care what his brothers think of him. And even when they come to Egypt, he still doesn't care what his brothers think of him. He is the same Yosef. So there's a certain consistency even in their somewhat dysfunctional behavior. He then gives Joseph a double portion, and we'll skip this little section about Shechem. He finally, before he dies, he wants to give a blessing to his sons. What's interesting about the blessings, okay, is that in verse 3, it's to Reuven. In verse 4, it's to Shimon and Levi. In verse 5, it's Yehuda. In verse 8, I'm sorry, it's Yehuda. In verse 13 is Zevulun. 14 is Yisachar. 15, 16 is Dan. 17, 18, 19 is Gad. 20 is Asher. Naphtali. And then, of course, Yosef and Binyamin. So he gets all the tribes and he gives them each a blessing, except not everyone gets a blessing. You'd think, Yaakov is on his deathbed, he would give a blessing to everyone. Except Reuven, Shimon, and Levi do not get a blessing. What do they get? I wouldn't say a curse, but I'll certainly say they get a rebuke. Let's read what happens. First of all, in verse 2, he says, sons of, assemble and hearken, O sons of Jacob, hearken to Israel your father. He uses both names poetically. He says, Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might and my first fruit, exceeding in rank and exceeding in honor. That sounds all good. And then he said, unstable as water. You shall excel no longer. When you mounted your father's bed, you brought disgrace. My couch you mounted. Whoa. There is a story that at some point Reuven, first of all, Reuven did not take the responsibility when Yosef was being sold. He had the chance to save Yosef, he didn't. I'm not sure how much Yaakov knew about that. But then it says that Reuven slept with one of Yaakov's concubines, Bilhah. And that is always a power move when the child, goes into the tent of the elder, and that happened later on in the Bible. So Yaakov takes him to task. He says, you were my elder, my firstborn. I had so much expectation from you. And then you are unstable in your accepting of responsibilities. And it's certainly when you brought disgrace to me. That's how Yaakov leaves it. Very harsh words. But not as harsh as the next ones. Simeon and Levi, you're a pair. Your weapons are tools of lawlessness. Let not my person be included in their council. Let not my being be counted in their assembly. For when they're angry, they slay men. And when pleased, they maim oxen. Cursed is their anger and their wrath so relents them. I will divide them in Jacob and I will scatter them in Israel. Harsh, because of course, Yaakov is talking to them about what they did in Shechem. If you remember the story, Shimon and Levi went and took their swords and killed men, women, and child in Shechem. After they made a deal and they said, you have to get a circumcision, they went and killed everyone. And Yaakov on his deathbed said, these two should never be together. Now, he didn't say that Shimon and Levi are evil. He said when the two of them are together, they create terrible things. And therefore, his curse, which is a blessing, said, I will make sure that they will never be together. And if they're never together, then they will succeed in their own. And Levi, of course, becomes the prophet. The priest. Levi becomes the priest. So he succeeds as long as he's not under the influence of Shimon and vice versa. Then finally he gets to Judah, and he spends a lot on Judah, verses 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Why does he spend so much time on Judah? The answer is because in the end, and he favored Joseph the whole time. But at the end, on his deathbed, he chooses Judah to lead his nation. He says the following, Yehuda, your brothers will acknowledge you as the leader. Your father's sons will bow to you. You're a lion. You crouch like a lion. You're the king of the beasts. the scepter will not depart from Judah. So Yaakov understood that despite the fact that Yosef is the chosen one by God, Yehuda is the chosen one by man. That's fascinating. Yaakov's choice is for Yehuda to hold on to the scepter because Yosef was a great dreamer, but a bad communicator. Whereas Yehuda was able to earn the respect of the people, of the brothers, of the nation, and the kings that would follow suit and follow in line. And therefore, Yehuda is chosen as the leader of the people. He continues to say nice blessings and praises about Zevulun, where he will live, and Yisachar, what type of person he will be, and Dan, who will be a judge, and Gad, who will have luck, and Asher will have oil, and Naphtali will be like a gazelle. And then he does spend several verses, many verses, about the greatness of Yehuda, and finally, the final verse about Benjamin, who will be like a wolf. In verse 28, he says the following: all these were the tribes of Israel, 12 in number. This is what their father said to them, and he bade them farewell. He addressed each one with the parting word, and then he instructed them, saying, I'm about to be gathered to my kin, which means I'm about to die. Bury me in the cave of Machpelah, where my father is buried, where Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Rebekah, and that's where I buried Leah. And when he did this, he drew his feet into his bed, he breathed his last breath, and he was gathered to his people. This then is the end of the legacy of Yaakov. As we said, it's complex. As we said, it is filled with tumultuous experiences that were always a part of him. He's never letting anyone forget that. But through his struggles, he nevertheless built the nation of Israel, the tribe of Israel, which would become the nation of Israel. And not only did he build that tribe, but he enforced the feeling of connection to the homeland, connection to each other, connection to their tradition, so much so that even though hundreds of years are now going to pass in slavery, the people do not disappear. They do not assimilate. They stay connected, they stay a family, they stay a nation. And I think it is due to Yaakov, and it is due to what he inculcated into them, the message of family, of struggle, of God, of Israel, and of your legacy, and of always aspiring to be something even greater than you are right now. And this then ends Yaakov's life. And at the end, the next chapter is that Yosef cries, and they have a big burial, and they do take his bones, and they take him back to bury him in Marat Machpelah in Israel. And then Yosef returns, and this is what I mentioned last time, that the brothers now were afraid that Yosef was going to hate them, which is crazy. You know, they lived for 17 years together, and you'd think that they would be friends and they would be family and everything be wonderful. But the brothers always knew that it wasn't exactly harmonious. And Yosef said, no, don't worry, brothers. I'm always there to take care of you. That's my job. That's my role. It wasn't that they, in the end, had a happy kumbaya lifetime. His children, his grandchildren, and his great-grandchildren. And at the end, following in his father's footsteps, in verse 24, he says, I'm about to die. I want you guys to do the same for me that we did for our father Jacob, which is take my bones out of here and bring him back to Israel. And that would only take place hundreds of years later during the Exodus, because at this point he was going to be embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt. And this there then concludes our Parsha and concludes the book of Bereshit. The book of Bereshit, which, the first three stories are, of course, creation, Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, and Noah, that's separate. But from Abraham and on, it's really about a man, his wife, and their children and their family, and their drive to spread the name of God in the land where God chose them to be. And it ends with them not being in that land any longer. And it's a bit of a cliffhanger. Of course, we know what happens, but it's a cliffhanger because there seems to be, it veered from what the ideal was supposed to be, that they were supposed to be following Abraham's prophecy and the fulfillment of that gift to Abraham and Isaac, stay in the land and be blessed and have a great nation. But instead, they end up in a foreign land, and we'll soon find out that they end up being enslaved even, but they don't end up lost. They don't end up completely assimilated. Maybe due to Yaakov, that most, they remember who they are and what they stand for, and that keeps them together to take on whatever comes their way in the future. That's all I have to share. Thank you very much for joining.
Thank you.
If you have any questions or comments, my pleasure.
Not really.
Thank you, Margaret. Oh, there's my son. Son, do you have something you'd like, and my daughter, you'd like to share?
We really enjoyed it. Thank you very, very much.
I appreciate it.
I'll discuss all my comments a little bit later when I see you.
Okay, I look forward to hearing them and proving you wrong.
Love you dearly. Have a good night.
Okay, good night, everyone. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Night,
Good night.
night.
Take care, Robert.
Take care, Robert.